Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sadia Zafar from HRAI, and I would like to welcome you to today's session on energy recovery ventilation, which is brought to you by Mitsubishi Electric and RenewAire. Our presenters, Will Elleride from Mitsubishi Electric, Nick Agopian, and Anthony Barbiero from RenewAire. They will discuss understanding the problem of construction methodologies causing deficient indoor air quality, understanding standards and codes, and the justification of increased ventilation rates, and learning about the differences between various energy recovery devices. You will notice on the control panel of your screen the Q&A feature. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions at any time during the webinar. They will be addressed at the end of the session. Also note, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent to you following the session. Now we will start by welcoming Will.
Thank you, Sadia. As Sadia already said, my name is Will Elleride. I take care of the ventilation products for Mitsubishi Electric Sales Canada, which is based out of Markham, Ontario. And one of our product lines for ventilation is RenewAire, which we've been the main distributor for this product in Canada for many, many years. And today I'm happy to introduce Nick Agopian, who is our VP of Sales and Marketing from RenewAire, and Anthony Barbiero, who is our Sales Director for Canada. And today we'll be, we'll be handing the floor over to Nick Agopian, who'll be focusing today on indoor air quality. And take it away, Nick. Hopefully everybody will find this very informative.
Thank you, Will. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Sadia, for the introduction. What an incredible time when it comes to HVAC products. You know, being involved in the industry as long as I have, I find it really interesting that no one really says anything great about HVAC. They only call the HVAC people when there's something wrong, but it's something that happens in the background and people just expect it to run. It's when it doesn't run is when problems arise, and usually when problems arise, it's usually an adversarial situation. But with the environment that we have today and something called SARS and COVID-19, HVAC has elevated and percolated up right to the top because HVAC clearly within the built environment has something to do with either increasing the potential of infections or decreasing the potential infections. And I'll touch on that a little bit. But what I'm hoping I can do is try to teach you something with regards to what is ventilation, because there's always an opportunity that we can learn something. So just a little bit of fun here on stuff that maybe we didn't know and we can always learn, which is what this seminar and presentation is all about. Like, did you know, well, and this is typically pre-COVID, that 40% of the cars that are driving around in city centers are simply looking for a parking spot. They're not trying to leave or go anywhere, but just going around in circles looking for a simple parking spot. Also, a lot of people think that it's very critical that we protect the rainforest, and it's true. We do need to protect the rainforest. And a lot of people say it's because of the oxygen it generates. What if I was to tell you all that the oxygen that comes out of the rainforest from all the trees in the rainforest is consumed by the animals in the rainforest? In fact, none of the oxygen that comes out of the rainforest comes to us, whether it's in Canada, in the US, in Europe, or whatever the case may be, or South America, or anywhere in the Caribbean. But what actually happens is the capillary effect, where the trees are sucking up the water through the roots, going through the trunks, all the way to the leaves, and then evaporating. And the second it evaporates, it starts with the whole hydrologic cycle, where the moisture goes into the clouds or into the atmosphere. Clouds are formed, and these clouds move through the jet stream and hit the Andes. The second they hit the Andes is when precipitation starts. And that precipitation goes over the Andes and over the rocks in the Andes and picks up impurities, like whatever may be on the rocks, and ends up in the water. When it ends up in the water, there are these little organisms called diatoms. These diatoms consume these nutrients that come off of the rocks in the Andes, and these little things in the billions and trillions in the water produce the actual oxygen that we breathe in every single day. So the rainforest has something to do with the oxygen that we breathe, but it's not the oxygen that comes from the trees. It's from these little things that are called diatoms. As a side note, if you were to take 90 minus the latitude, wherever you are in the world will actually equal your ground temperature. Just some fun facts. A little bit of information with regards to construction, because we used to think that construction and construction methodologies had something to do with deficient indoor air quality or the indoor air quality that we may have in the space. And that's partly true. Structures are becoming tighter and tighter with lower infiltration. And in the early 1900s, we used approximately 19 materials of construction. And in about 100 years later, where we are today, what if I was to tell you that we use 55,000 materials for the typical construction that used to use only 50? And that contributes to what we call deficient indoor air quality. A little bit of trivia, and all of you, or maybe at least some of you may have heard this, but we consume about 4 pounds of water daily. We also consume about 4 pounds of food daily. But when it comes to air and when it comes to what we breathe through our noses, we breathe in 31 pounds of air daily. And as you can see from the pictures here, you know, water has an expiry date, which is really funny because the water that we drink today is the same water that dinosaurs used to drink. But yet we have an expiry date. In 1890, William Thomson Sedgwick said that there was a connection between contaminated water and cholera. So we started looking at water purity and the quality of water that comes through our fountains or through our faucets. Also in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed both Pure Food and the Drugs Act with regards to meat inspection, or basically food. We had to be careful with regards how we served food, how we prepared food, and it was imperative that all that food met strict guidelines. But when it comes to the air we breathe, there is no such protocol in place. And what's really interesting is that when we look at the systems that we have in our body, whether it's our stomach, our intestines, our kidneys, our livers, they've evolved and they've advanced over the millions and millions of years to be able to take on impurities. So you can eat something that's contaminated. Yes, you might feel a little bit sick, but your body can fight it off because that system has evolved and is quite advanced. But when it comes to your lungs, there's been no evolution to that. But yet when we breathe in air, compared to what we eat and drink, it is much higher. But yet there's no expiry to the air or understanding the half-life of air. So what we breathe in becomes imperative with regards to the physiological operation of the human body, and we'll get into that. 79, 70, and 89. Our average life is about 79 years. We spend 20 years within residential buildings and 50 years, or non-residential buildings, and 50 years in residential buildings. And the United States EPA has deemed that indoor air is 2 and more like 5 times and up to 100 times more polluted than outdoor air. We have a severe cognitive dissonance associated to what is indoor air. You know, think about January, wherever you are, and especially if you're in Alberta and in Edmonton and it's absolutely freezing outside, you come inside, you say, oh, thank God for HVAC engineers because it's warm. So we feel like we're protected. Conversely, think about being somewhere like in Montreal in the middle of summer where it's 30 degrees and like 70% RH and it's hot and it's humid. You come indoors, thank God for HVAC engineers because you feel cool and it's dehumidified and you have this essence that you're protected indoors. But what we can't see and we can't touch and we can't feel, we don't believe is actually there. That's just fundamental on how humans think. But indoor air and all the stuff we can't see, feel, or touch actually does have a negative impact, and indoor air is dirtier than outdoor air. And we spend, because of the amount of time we have indoors, almost 90% of our life indoors. When we take a look at the more susceptible people, like children or the elderly, they're spending 95% of their time indoors. When we look at ventilation, Ventilation has been around for millions of years. Early humans knew that they can bring fire indoors and stay warm if they knew how to ventilate the cave. Egyptian stone carvers knew that they can become more efficient if they carve the stone outside of the pyramids rather than inside the pyramids. Middle Ages, they knew that if they opened windows on both sides of these hospitals, they can lower the potential of disease spread within these hospitals. So ventilation has been around for millions of years, and in early 1800s was the first standard that came out with regards to functionally bringing in outdoor air within the built environment. And it's gone up and it's gone down throughout the years. It came down back during the oil embargo, for those of you that have been around in the late 70s and 1980s. And then that sprung with sick building syndrome and deficient indoor air quality. And then we immediately brought it back up again. And we associate ventilation as being the cause of electrical costs. And it's true, because ventilation and controlling the temperature of that ventilation air is anywhere between 40 to 60% of the plug load of these buildings. Unless you're in a hospital, then it's much lower because there's so much equipment and machinery that's in operation. But it is a major portion on the operational cost of a building. So it's understandable that you want to try to bring that down. And ventilation and standards for ventilation have gone from being a health standard to just being a ventilation standard and a number where you pick up a standard or a code, you enter from the left side, you come in from the top of a table, where it intersects, that's your number, and you just run with it. But what does that number really mean? And what does that number really do, which is what we're trying to teach over here. So why do we ventilate? Whether it's in a home or whether it's in an office building or a restaurant, plant, it doesn't matter. But why do we ventilate? Once in a while, or most of the time actually, you'll hear people say, I've got moisture or I've got mold. Basically, I have an odor. Sometimes they're able to smell something. So once they smell something, they say, oh yeah, I'm cognizant. There's something that's going on. And every chemical has, or every odor has a chemical formulation. Often we'll hear people say carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and radon, because those have become kind of buzzwords in buildings and in homes as well. Occasionally, you'll hear people talk about PM 2.5, which we'll address in a second. You'll have nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde, ozone, TVOCs compared to SVOCs that comes up. And what we've done is where now we use 55,000 products of construction, which contributes to deficient indoor air quality or why we ventilate. Our activities indoors is even more complex, and us as human beings are contaminant sources as well. And we now know you've got products like formaldehyde that are Class A carcinogens, amongst other things, which we'll talk about in a second. But when we take a look at these products of construction, for those of you who remember, think about painting a room and you couldn't use the room for, I don't know, a day, 2 days, or maybe up to 3 days. Sorry for that phone call. Today, because of that unpleasant smell, we use paints that are water-based, but essentially they're using SVOCs, which is semi-volatile organic compounds, as compared to TVOCs, which is total volatile organic compounds, which had that very heavy smell. So the difference between the two is now you can paint the room and use it that night, so we feel happy. The difference is that when it was TVOCs, you couldn't use the room for 2 or 3 days, and then you're okay to use the room. In SVOCs, you don't smell anything because it's below the threshold limit that we're able to smell at, but we off-gas the VOC for 25 years. So now you have this thing called prolonged exposure. And that's something we should keep in mind as we go through this presentation on the term of what prolonged exposure is and what is the negative impact of prolonged exposure, even when you've got low concentration, or what we'll dub as nano impacts. And then all the cleaning compounds that we use today, especially over the last year, where we're using more ammonias and more chlorines that stay within the space because we've built these structures so tight today in order to maintain the controlled environment as compared to the non-controlled environment. And that helps us in lowering the operational cost of the structure. fantastic. But by doing that, we're keeping all of these contaminants indoors when we ventilate and sometimes underventilate, and the potential to overventilate. So now I did mention something about PM 2.5, and I'd like to address what that is and the criticality behind that and why it's so important today in the standards community as we write the new standards that's going to be adopted by code. So here's a strand of hair, and here's this, some fine beach sand, and you can see the delta between the two of these. And then you have the blue dot on the strand of hair. The blue dot is PM10. That's 10 micron. That's particles that are 10 micron in diameter. The red dot on the blue dot on the strand of hair is your PM 2.5. This is what you see here looking through an electron scan microscope. It's very, very small. You typically can't see it unless it is being reflected off of sunlight. Now try to reflect on what I'm about to say. Think about waking up at 10 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning, and you didn't close your blinds at night, and the sun just happens to be coming in at the right angle. And then where the sun ray is, you see all that stuff that's floating in the air. Where the sun ray ends on this side, it disappears. But the stuff that you see floating where the sun ray is, that's PM 2.5. It's the sun ray is being reflected off of that, and you see that floating around in the air. And it moves in a Brownian movement, so it's random, and it stays afloat in the air. And when it stays afloat, where is it staying afloat at? Your breathing zone. So why is it important? It's so small that we are able to breathe it in. It passes our primary filtration in the nostrils and ends up in our lungs. And if you remember, unlike our stomachs and intestines and liver and kidney, that's fairly advanced and evolved, our lungs haven't. So it sits in our lungs. It is so small that it is smaller than a red blood cell. It could move through tissue. I've been moving around as I give this presentation. You sat down when just before this presentation, and you're going to stand up later on. Essentially, as you move, that particle will move through tissue and end up in your bloodstream. And the Institute of Medicine has now deemed it a promoter of heart attacks and strokes. It ends up in your bloodstream, and it reacts in your bloodstream just like triglycerides, which you get from cheese and alcohol. But it thickens your blood. And you think about making a consomme soup, which is very liquidy and it's almost like water, as compared to like Hungarian goulash, which is very thick and it becomes very viscous. And for all of us engineers out here, just remember your piping design days. The more viscous the fluid is, the harder it is to pump. What is your pump? Your heart. And the harder you make it to pump, the more strain you put on your heart. So clearly, it's a contributor to heart attacks and strokes. That is dust. In California, under Title 24, they now mandate that whether you're a house or an office building or a restaurant, when you're at a certain distance from a highway, which is almost anywhere in Southern California, by code, by law, you must use a MERV 13 filter. Now we want to use a MERV 13 filter because of SARS, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But they mandated that 2 years ago. Think about this. Think about your car. What are the two consumables you have in your car? Tires and brakes. Where do they go? They don't end up in the stratosphere because they're too heavy. So they stay right around where we live. And in California, because of the number of cars that are over there, they now mandate MERV 13 in all applications because of this PM 2.5. Today, we're studying PM1, which is 1 micron in diameter. And the concern is that it's around us, it ends up in our eyes, and we do this. Now, I'm not really doing it because I know what I'm about to tell you, but we do this and we rub our eye. We need to stop doing that, because it is suspect that PM1 that ends up in your eye irritates your eye, you rub it, and it ends up in your ocular vein. And in the ocular vein, it is a direct transporter right into your brain, and is being suspect for Alzheimer's. So a simple thing called dust actually has some very negative adverse effects to the physiological operation of the human body. That is detrimental, that is irreversible. So now yes, I can almost say thank you, SARS, because now people are using MERV 13 filters because that is an immediate reaction as compared to, as I alluded to a second ago, these nano impacts over a prolonged period. Well, these nano impacts over a prolonged period have an effect, and we don't attribute that to things like PM 2.5. But MERV 13 filtration becomes very critical. If there's one takeaway you have from this presentation, tonight, when you go home, or if you're at home tonight, pass by your local hardware store for your house and buy a MERV 13 filter for your house, and even for your office if you can. So particle dust is very critical, and this is something that's being entertained in the standards writing to become the new standard. Of course, it could be because of SARS, because SARS catapults that right up to the chain because it has an immediate impact. But regardless of SARS, SARS is one thing, but everything else as well in improving indoor air quality becomes paramount, whether we're in a pandemic or whether we're not in a pandemic. So we talk about activities on what we do indoors, whether it's within the office space or even at home. But if I was to ask everybody here, what goes into laundry detergent? And this is a rhetorical question. You can't answer it because it's an unregulated industry. We don't truly know what's inside some of this stuff. But Dr. Colbert ran a study in Seattle, Washington. And what he found is that there's over 25 volatile organic compounds, of which seven of them are hazardous, that comes out of your laundry room. 2 of those chemicals, acetaldehyde and benzene, are grouped as carcinogens by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And those sheets that you put into your dryer, for those of you who go hunting and you end up in the woods, or if you're in an area in your backyard and there's a lot of bugs, if you want to protect yourself against these bugs, take 2 of those sheets that you typically put into the dryer and put one on each side of your body under your belt and go into the woods. And I guarantee you no insect will come close to you, because insects are smart enough to stay away from that stuff. But meanwhile, we use it every single day. Now, what he also did is a mass balance equation that looked at what is the concentration of particularly these 2 gases, acetaldehyde and benzene, which comes from vehicular emissions as well. And what he found is if you take 6% of all the vehicular emissions in Seattle, Washington, as compared to all the laundry rooms in Seattle, Washington, it's the equivalent and it's the same. It's saying that if you run your laundry room, you could take 6% of your vehicular exhaust for acetaldehyde and benzene and just pump it into your house. So now we know that activity becomes very critical. You've got products of construction, you've got activity, and you also have bioeffluents, which we'll address in a moment. So we said SARS. SARS has come around, and what has SARS done? SARS has looked at the indoor environment and said this indoor environment has to be addressed. We know that all cognizant authorities, whether it's in Europe underneath the Federation of European Heating, Ventilation, and Air Conditioning Associations, or AHRI, or even other cognizant authorities like the CDC, that recommend the use of ventilation. Even if you take a look at cognizant authorities like the Well Building Institute, they're recommending you get a well point if you put 30% more outdoor air. You get 2 well points if you put in 60% outdoor air. You get 3 well points if you can guarantee your CO2, your carbon dioxide, is below 600 ppm. Carbon dioxide was thought to be an inert gas and a surrogate gas for deficient indoor air quality. So when your carbon dioxide goes up, that means your indoor air quality is poor. But today, we now know that carbon dioxide is a contaminant of concern, which we'll address in a second. And while I don't have that much time in this presentation, we can send you this presentation, and there are links that you can go to for the well building standard, and even other links that show you how ventilation is paramount on controlling the spread, which means that you can have all the filters you want in the space. Without ventilation, you're still going to increase potential infection rates and contamination within the space. With ventilation operating correctly, then you can lower that, and increased ventilation further lowers the potential of infection within spaces. And for those of you who are interested, we can take this offline, or if you can reach out to Will or Anthony or myself, and we can talk to you how increased ventilation lowers the potential of risk and how it's rationalized with energy recovery. Because without energy recovery, then at that point, it's going to become economically prohibitive to heat and cool all that air. But when you look at energy recovery technologies, what's interesting is that plate type energy recovery technologies, which is different than other technologies out there like wheels that control the potential of cross-contamination to below 0.1%. Because when you take a look at plate type energy recovery technologies, these are membranes similar to like fuel cells, where you don't have or you have a physical separation between the two sides and you don't have cross-contamination. So when we look at energy recovery and we take a look at the guidelines from AHRI, not all energy recovery technologies are treated equally. And when you look at AHRI certification, people look at efficacy, which is important because that's paramount when we're looking at energy recovery. But in concert with efficacy under AHRI standard 1060, they have a metric of cross-contamination, and you can demand that information from the energy recovery supplier to make sure that you are below 0.1%. And most of the time when you're looking at wheels, they're more like 12, 15%. So they're very, very far away from what you actually need. With this presentation, you'll get these links and you'll be able to service yourself on some of this information. But once again, we can take it offline for a more detailed discussion. But when we take a look at the CDC is very, very, very cognizant of the criticality behind increased ventilation, meaning improve the ventilation system, because no matter what you look at, foundationally, ventilation must be there. So if you're using different types of filtration technologies, which is good because there's nothing wrong with that, without ventilation, that's not going to work. And there's been so many studies out there that have proved that. And this one particular document that came out in March 23rd specifically addresses the criticality behind minimally ventilation being there and how increased ventilation becomes critical. In addition, what they talk about is the concerns behind fogging for disinfection using chemicals and certain types of technologies, particularly when it comes to hydrogen peroxide or different ionization technologies. With ionization technologies, yes, there are concerns of ozone, but that's not the concern. The concern is ROSs, which is reactive oxygenated species. The second that you have an ion that's in the air, that's free, it attaches itself to, let's say, maybe even just the dust. PM 2.5 is an example. Well, that ion is unhappy. So it finds another piece of PM 2.5 dust and it attaches it. So now it's a little bit larger. You get another ion that connects to the two PM 2.5 dust particles and it attaches to two more. So now you got four. So it becomes larger and you can filter it out a lot easier, or it falls out of the air and ends up on the ground and then you just vacuum it out, which is no big deal. But when you've got that ion now, because it's not selective and it attaches itself to an oxygen, now you have a reactive oxygenated species. And that in itself is very unhappy and very unstable and needs to do something. And it does do well when you've got, let's say, an acid gas like H2S or SO2 or a VOC. It does react with it. But the problem is that when you have an oxygen with a reactive ion and we breathe it in and it touches a human living cell is where the problem comes into play. And that's one of the reasons why there's so much concern about ionization and some of the lawsuits that have been filed or class action lawsuits that have been filed, at least minimally here in the United States. But even the CDC guidelines that says, as you read here, when considering air cleaning technologies that potentially or intentionally expose building occupants, the safety data should be applicable to all occupants, including those with health conditions that could be aggravated by this treatment. Now, of course, this is like code language, right? So if we were to dissect that, what that means that if you use this kind of technology within the built environment, or what now people are calling the shared environment, you need to put a sticker outside before you enter that says, hey, we are using these kind of technologies, and as an FYI, it could aggravate your respiratory system. So a little concern on the type of filtration that you may be looking at designing when it comes to SARS. But once again, foundationally, we're not talking about filtration, we're talking about the criticality behind ventilation and increased ventilation. And all of these cognizant authorities are saying we need to look at that. This came out May 16th from Bloomberg, and what it's calling for, they put together, I think, 239 scientists from around the world that are asking codes and standards to be written around increased ventilation. What are we looking for today when we're looking at increased ventilation? We're looking at building resiliency. We come indoors to a building or the built environment because we want to protect ourselves from the outdoors. Well, we do that because, like I said, when it's really cold outside, we come in, we feel protected, we can take our coats off when it's January, or conversely, when it's really hot outside, you could come inside and you cool down so you feel protected. Well, building resiliency has to continue now and be elevated to the point where the building itself should be able to protect the occupants against other things other than comfort. So now these standards that are being written across the board are looking at the building environment as a health concern. So standards are no longer just, oh, it's that number that I told you that you enter from the left and you go in from the top and you intersect and there's your value. It's no longer that. It is a health standard and protection. So there's a lot of call to say, okay, these minimum standards, if we need to maintain them as they are, we can, or we need to increase them by this 30% or 60% as advocated by the Well Building Institute. And there's a link for those of you who haven't seen it. They put together $100 million campaign using A-listers like Jennifer Lopez and Lady Gaga and Robert De Niro, and the list goes on and on and on, talking about the criticality in protecting people indoors by this increased ventilation. And these scientists, as you see here, are recommending that even over and above the pandemic, that increased ventilation can help in protecting against something like catching a flu, which costs the United States over $50 billion a year. So now, when we look at ventilation, it is something that's for sustainability and resiliency within the built environment, or once again, the shared environment. Because we now know, with all the modeling that's out there, when you're in a room with other people, you are breathing in their bioeffluents and you are breathing in anything that they may have that they exhale. So it's critical that we protect the air, or we understand the expiry date of air, or more importantly, the half-life of air, and how much higher should the ventilation rate be, or how much higher should the air change rate be within spaces. So a lot of these codes and standards now are all being rewritten. And if they are going to follow the minimum, which will be increased anyways, there is going to be something that's going to be a higher standard. So for standard 62.1, they're coming up with guideline 42P, which is a guideline for a higher performing building. And these higher performing buildings will require higher ventilation rates. And we know that in Europe, they have these Class A, Class B, and Class C building. A Class C is like what we have today. When we look at a Class A or Class B is when you have MERV 13 filtration. A Class A is when you have MERV 13 filtration and increased ventilation. And people will pay more for these kind of structures or these kind of spaces to the tune of almost 37% higher rents by putting in MERV 13 and increased ventilation. If you put in MERV 13 and increased ventilation with energy recovery that has a payback, it's not going to be 37% additional cost. So for a building owner, their yield will improve by having improved indoor air quality. So how successful have we been when we take a look at ventilation and a healthier indoor air. And this is a study that was done by Armin Rudd by the US Department of Energy, and they looked at no ventilation all the way to ERV balanced ventilation. And the best way to maintain the lowest steady state concentration of all of these gases is through balanced ventilation, which is very, very critical. When we look at the Institute of Medicine, and this is where AHRI is, they know that by increasing the amount of outdoor air by just double, we can lower the amount of contamination indoors on both particulates, gases, and pathogens by just increased ventilation, which is the most sustainable way within spaces. Of course, filtration works, but with filtration, there's consumables. With consumables, there's also, of course, the requirement of hiring people to maintain these systems. Ventilation is the only sustainable way and is proven scientifically to lower the steady state concentration of these contaminants within the, once again, shared environment. No matter where you look, the American Lung Association, they look at clean air at home, at work, and at schools, and everywhere you look, it talks about increased ventilation. We must increase ventilation from what these standards are, because standards that code follows. And I was looking at a home, and the builder said, "Oh, you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry because we built to code." And I went to the guy and I said, "You know what you just told me? You put in the absolute minimum you have to put in order for you not to go to jail, or all of us as designers to go to jail." So that term, increased ventilation, is across the board. And it's not just cognizant authorities like AHRI and the European one as well, but you've got CDC, you've got the American Lung Association, and even the Canadian government. And you can download from the Canadian government website this IA Quest, which is a platform that helps you determine how much outdoor air you need in improving indoor air quality. And I urge you all to, well, once again, I think you're gonna get this presentation and you can download this information, or please just go to the the Government of Canada website. And if any one of you can take a snippet of this, you can do that today. So we talked about CO2 a little while ago, and we said, well, is it a surrogate, for these demand ventilation things? And I don't know where this 1,000 ppm came from for these demand ventilation companies to say, okay, close your outdoor air when you're below 1,000 ppm and open your outdoor air when you're above 1,000 ppm. In 62.1 standard, nowhere does it say that 1,000 ppm is good. It refers to it in one of the appendices because it was moved out of the standard and put into the appendices because there is no scientific research that says that that is healthy. But what we do know is that with NASA, the astronauts were making mistakes. And NASA looked at understanding what that was. They looked at food, they looked at water, they looked at sleeping, the clothes, all that kind of stuff. At the end, what they found is that the concentration of CO2 up at the space station was problematic. And they had two problems, a reversible problem and an irreversible problem. So what's happening? CO2 goes up within the space, CO2 concentration lifts up in your lungs, and then CO2 concentration goes up in your blood and lowers oxygen. Your primary organ, which is your brain, says, I'm the primary organ, I need more oxygen in order to operate, and dilates the vessels in your brain. So that causes headaches, nausea, dizziness, muscle twitching, goes on and on and on. Why? Because your skull is stationary, you get a dilation of your vessels, and it puts pressure against your brain. The second you go, somewhere where there's lower concentration of CO2, then that's reversible and it comes back down, and then you don't feel that problem. But you also have something called respiratory acidosis, and that increases acidity of your blood because of the CO2. And then that attacks bone marrow, and that is irreversible. Okay, so we can say, well, you know what? That's up in space. What does that mean for me? So Lawrence Berkeley Lab said, let's try to understand CO2 within the built environment. And what they found from this study, and once again, once you get this presentation, everything is cited in the bottom. Or once again, you can reach out to us and we can get you all of this information, or all of these studies if you're like me and you're a geek and you like to read up about it. But The concentrations we're talking about, 1,000 ppm and 1,500 ppm, and just so you know, the measured concentration in schools and in some buildings is over 2,000 ppm. In schools, above 3,500 ppm. Your bedroom can even reach up to 5,000 ppm, especially if you have a dog or two within the room. Very high concentrations, but we know that there is cognitive decline in concentrations from 500 ppm to 1,500 ppm. That's what we're trying to design to. And we know that the built environment in situ isn't that. It's even higher. But we can see cognitive decline accordingly. We know that test scores can increase between 12 and 18% in the test room for students just by decreasing CO2. And all these studies are all empirical research. Okay, so we know that we have cognitive decline on basic activity, focused activity, applied activity accordingly with increased concentration of CO2 in the from between 500 to 1,500 ppm. Once again, this is the area that we think we're living in. So when it comes to AHRI, and we're starting to look at this and we're trying to demand increased ventilation, we see guideline 42. And guideline 42, like I alluded to, is saying, let's understand what the body is going through. Let's understand this ocular exposure. Remember what I was talking about by rubbing your eye? Dermal exposure, inhalation, going through your cardiovascular system, ending up in your blood, and then ultimately in your brain. At AHRI, we're actually looking at this standard as a medical or a health standard, using medicine to help us understand how the physiological operation of the human body works when we expose it to some of these nano impacts on the stuff you can't see, touch, or smell. So this standard, or increased ventilation, regardless on whether we have a pandemic, has something to do with our longevity as well, which we'll touch on. There's something called DALY, which is Disability Adjusted Life Year. And this was a 10-year study by the Gates Foundation. Over $12 million was spent on this to try to understand our lives. And as you can see here, we have a baby with a healthy life. We have a red band here. That's an incident. For me, it was when I was like 9 years old and I fell down on my bicycle and I broke my arm, whatever. Then I had a healthy life. And then you have another red band, and then you have a healthy life. You have another red band. You notice the healthy life gets smaller, 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 smaller. We live with disability. Take a look at cigarette smoking. You have a lot of people that smoke cigarettes all their lives, and nothing against cigarette smokers. I don't smoke, but nothing against cigarette smokers. But later on in life, you end up with COPD, and you have what we call disability. And we're living with disability. Once again, like acetaldehyde and benzene and some of these other chemicals that we were talking about, cigarette smoking has a nano impact. Yes, there's the pleasure, from what I understand from people that smoke, but there's a nano impact. And then as you get older, you end up with disability or die young. Now, they looked at 75 different reasons: high blood pressure, tobacco smoking, alcohol use, low diet in fruits, high body mass index, childhood underweight, physical activity. They looked at everything. These are the top 10 reasons. 2 of the top 10 reasons are because of deficient indoor air quality. And when we look at these factors, as you see here from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, PM 2.5, which we talked about, lowers your life. Secondhand smoke, even third-hand smoke, radon, formaldehyde, acrolein, ozone, NO2, ammonia, acetaldehyde. It goes on and on and on. These exposures of these chemicals do lower your potential of lifespan over a lifetime of being exposed to these things. We can now mathematically calculate, if you expose yourself to these chemicals over time, your life will be reduced by X. So Lawrence Berkeley said, okay, fine. What does that really mean when it comes to ventilation? And they ran a study, and they showed that with base infiltration only, or unbalanced mechanical ventilation, or balanced mechanical ventilation, you can improve your lost years from 160 down to 70. Ladies and gentlemen, what is this saying? This is saying that how we expose ourselves to these contaminants in these nano impacts over a prolonged period of time, meaning our life, we can increase our potential lifespan. We can mathematically calculate the potential of your lifespan increasing by improving indoor air quality using ventilation. That's what that means. The result of the study from Lawrence Berkeley said, overall, the number of reported statistically significant improvements in health with increased ventilation rates far exceeded the anticipated chance improvements in health. What does that mean? That means that ventilation alone could and will improve your life and your health, just like walking, exercising, eating healthy, taking vitamins. Now, I'm not saying stop eating healthy and stop walking or exercising or taking your vitamins, but I'm saying in concert with that, ventilation has the same impact. So that table that we as engineers and contractors and for design build enter from the left and go in from the top and intersect with a number has a really significant impact on our lives and on the lives of the people that you're designing for. You know, I was talking to somebody from Google in their HR department because they demand double the local ventilation code rates. I said, why? And she told me, you know, Nick, just like everybody, we go and we say, yeah, you know, we've got flexible hours. Yeah, you can stand, you can sit, you can lie down, no problem at your workstation. Yeah, we're going to give you the vacation time that you want. And oh yeah, we're going to give you free food and beanbag chairs to sit on because, you know, you're millennials and you want that kind of stuff. But you know what we're going to offer you at Google? We're going to offer you a healthier environment for yourself because we double the ventilation rate per code. That is the selling feature that Google has when they're trying to hire people. So ventilation becomes very, very critical. And here is an example now. This is just ventilation rates for residential dwellings, but just as a focus, because this is what we did. This is what this individual ran this study on from a company called RED. And as you can see, we have a red line. That red line is what we use in North America, in Canada, and the US. Other than maybe Italy or Bulgaria or Czechoslovakia, every other European country has way better ventilation rates than we have here in the United States and in Canada. We try to pride ourselves as North Americans as being above everybody else and so on and so forth or whatever. But in actuality, when we take a look at something simple like ventilation rates, which I just talked about, becomes very critical to the physiological operation of the human body, to cognitive decision making, to test scores or longevity of life, and we are the lowest in First Nations around the world. We know from the Harvard studies that the cost of increased ventilation per person is about $10 to $40 per year. But the output is about $6,500. Where can you invest $40 where after a year you get $6,500 out of it? Also, sick building syndrome annual savings in the United States or from illnesses is about $58 billion just in the USA, and worker performance and decline is an additional $200 billion. So ventilation is great for pandemics. Why? Because that is an immediate reaction. Increasing ventilation lowers it. It's immediate. Everything I talked about when it comes to deficient indoor air quality being prolonged is also benefit with increased ventilation. So I know that's a lot to absorb, but what I was trying to do here is talk about the criticality behind what ventilation is and what ventilation does. And it's not just a table that you might have in a local code or that AHRI has in standard 62.1 or standard 62.2. There's a lot that goes on behind what goes into those numbers. And the need for increased ventilation is becoming paramount across the board. I was talking to an individual, an engineer in New York City, and I was giving a presentation for a passive house conference. And he took me off to the side. He says, Nick, he goes, I've got this developer and he wants to triple. He said, triple the amount of outdoor air. And how do I do that without making it uberly expensive to operate? And we talked about energy recovery, and we talked about how we can oversize and all that kind of stuff. I said, but why? Why triple? He says, well, you know, he's going to be selling these 500 square foot condos in Manhattan on Fifth Avenue for $2 million each. And he needs a differentiating value proposition. And ventilation is that, because he was able to prove, and he's read from something that he got from Marriott, where they're entertaining increased ventilation because sleep is improved if you increase ventilation rates and lower the contaminants inside the area where you sleep. Science proves that the environment that we live in, or that we sleep in the night before, is improved if you have increased ventilation on both cognitive and physical activity. I used to laugh when I used to say, oh, you know, these people in California, they have these oxygen tents, or these, you know, movie stars and all that. And you said, what a scam. They have it figured out. They are actually spot on, because that's when your body's trying to regenerate itself. And if it's being attacked by different contaminants or even our own bioeffluents, then it stops the regeneration process and is spending time and its effort just in maintaining or fighting off what it's being bombarded with. So ventilation is life for sure. And SARS has been able to, once again, as I said earlier, elevate that to prime time, because we know now that increased ventilation lowers the potential of infection and has opened everybody's eyes to how it improves a person's life accordingly. So at that point, I thank everybody for their patience, and I'm available to answer any questions if there's any questions. Otherwise, please feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk in more detail about anything that I discussed, or, as I said earlier, interested in the detailed reports of everything that I cited within this presentation. So I thank you very much.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that, Nick. It's Loretta Zita. I'm with HRAI. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications. And thank you so much for your presentation today. We really appreciate it. I do have some questions that I'd like to read out to you and hope that you could answer them. I have, the first one is from Jürgen. He's asking about why there's no mention of ultrafine particles, those extremely high number of particles that are 0.1 microns or smaller.
Okay, that's still being studied, but absolutely, as I alluded to, even the PM 2.5 and the PM1 has such a detrimental effect on our bodies we're trying to understand those first. But for sure, ultrafines in not necessarily 62.1 and 62.2 is being discussed, but in PC 2.4 and PC 2.3, as well as the Environmental Health Committee, which is EHC, are looking at ultrafines, which is critical. But when it comes to ultrafines, then at that point, only HEPA filtration is the recommendation accordingly, HEPA and ALPA. But HVAC systems can be upgraded today to minimally MERV 13 filtration, as I said, for SARS or for PM 2.5. When it comes to ultrafines, to what he's alluding to, that's quite complex. I know that's still being studied right now, but these systems that we have in place cannot, unless they're specially designed, handle the HEPA filters, and other products or portable products or what they call partial bypass filtration products is the only thing that can be recommended accordingly. I don't have that much detail on it just yet, but I do know that it is being studied. And thank you for bringing that up, because ultrafines are going to be even more of a concern when it comes to our bodies, whether we inhale it. Somebody told me that it could be absorbed through skin. I don't have any empirical, that's anecdotal. I don't have anything empirical about that. But I did speak to somebody at the EHC committee who made a comment along the lines that ultrafines can be absorbed into skin, which is obviously extremely problematic. But he's right. That is a concern, and it's going to be a lot more complex to handle because the majority of the HVAC systems that are out there won't be able to handle the additional pressure drop. But we are looking at the efficacies associated to partial bypass, meaning when you have a 10,000 CFM system, you can partial bypass 1,000 CFM through a HEPA filtration unit, and then end up with a steady state within the space that's going to be, I'm not sure what the concentration of PM1 or PM.1 would be at that point, but that is something that's being studied right now. But it would require HEPA filtration without a doubt, or ALPA filtration if that's affordable.
Wait, I have two more questions. Oh, sorry, go on.
And please write a follow-up question to that if you want me to elaborate a little further. But go ahead to the next question.
Okay, yeah, we have two more questions. I have John Harris. He's asking, why is air change the metric for the AIVC study you quoted? I've never been able to draw the connection between the contaminant rates and the building volume.
Okay, because of steady state concentration. So when we take a look at how we design HVAC systems around comfort, so that's cooling and or heating, air change rates aren't as critical. But why air change rates are critical when it comes to that kind of concern, or the concern that he's alluding to, is because we have a generation rate. And the air change rates for controlling what we're going to try to attain, which is the lowest possible steady state concentration, is going to far exceed anything that's going to be required for comfort purposes. So it's all about maintaining the lowest steady state concentration and the air change rate, because you have a certain volume of space. And when you have a generation of something, no matter what it is, it could be peeling an orange and you have that orange smell, or an adverse contaminant like SARS or a pathogen, then at that point, it's going to try to equalize amongst the entire area. And the only way that we can remove it is by addressing air change. And air change says, okay, fine, you're going to be releasing something, or once again, the generation rate is X. And we have to use air change because that volume is going to be filled with whatever that generation is within X period of time. So it's a time-based thing based on generation, and that's why they use air change rates. And I can show you mathematically through modeling why that becomes the case, if he's interested in reaching out to me accordingly.
Great. Okay, so I have one more question. It's from Vlad, a rhetorical question.
Okay.
How to find a balance between bringing more fresh air into the building and reducing energy consumption to treat this air to the level of comfort?
That's where the only way we can, so when we look at the cognizant authorities, they are saying they are recommending increased ventilation, or opening your windows and so on and so forth, which is essentially increased ventilation. The only thing you can do is rationalizing it with energy recovery. And when you look at what we had to do with this building in Manhattan, we had to oversize the energy recovery such that we're able to achieve 90% or 90+% energy recovery on the sensible, and somewhere in the range, I think it was about 68% on the latent, in order to combat this concern of increased energy input if we don't accordingly. So it's energy recovery. It's the only thing we can look at. You're going to bring in outdoor air, and you're going to spend money in conditioning that air, no matter what it may be, whether it's heating or cooling or humidifying or dehumidifying. That air has that energy put into it. And recapturing that energy becomes paramount. It's the only way we're going to be able to rationalize it. However, the energy standards that are out there are based on certain conditions. Today, we know that with the built environment and buildings or homes being built as tight as they are today, there's going to have to be a balance between what is the energy profile of the building to conform to code, and is that the right number, or should that number be increased because we now know this shared environment has to be looked at as a as an incubator that's going to require extra outdoor air, which means that these numbers that we have in place today, which are pre-pandemic numbers, are no longer going to be viable. But once again, we know that energy recovery is the only way to rationalize increased ventilation. And even with that, these numbers still have to be looked at, like basically 90.1, AHRI 90.1 numbers still have to be reviewed post-pandemic, because